So I'm actually going to start off with just a bit of a provocative question, which was the ask from Guy and Kim, is from a corporate perspective, there's a lot of tools that organizations use in the energy sector that could be leveraged to apply the ecosystem services approach. And so that's what I really want to focus the discussion is could we use what they're already using, but modified and tailored with the right science, with the right acknowledgement of policy, and with the right tools as well. So 4 points that I'd like you to walk away with today. So the first is that the exclusion of ecosystem services in corporate decision-making is leaving a blind spot in corporate risk management. That the availability of ecosystem services is a material risk for decision-makers in the oil and gas sector. Many companies are using tools in disclosure to communicate already their risks and material issues related to environmental performance, and that oil and gas companies could be applying a standardized ecosystem services approach with the right indicators to improve measurement, reporting, and management of ecosystem services. So I'm going to walk us through each one of these. So as I said, it's a blind spot in corporate decision-making if we're not including ecosystem services. On an annual basis, on a daily basis, on a quarterly basis, oil and gas companies are conducting risk assessments and understanding the trade-offs that they need to make in terms of how they allocate capital and the decisions that they make around their strategies. They face a number of risks. They try and deal with strategic, operational, reputational, and others. And the tools that they use will allow them to identify, assess, respond to, and report and communicate both internally, like management reports, board reports, et cetera, but also externally, things like your management disclosure and analysis, or MD&A. I've worked with a lot of companies doing risk assessment work, and the environment is never absent. It's one of those pillars of assessing your risk when you look at health and safety, financial, regulatory, et cetera. So the environment is at the table when decision makers and companies are looking at their risks. However, it's often just included in terms of things like what's the potential likelihood for a spill on our line? You know, what's the potential for a leakage from our tailings pond? So the information that they're using to assess the risk isn't as sophisticated as it could be to enable them to really make trade-off decisions. Some just specific examples that we could use if we applied an ecosystem services lens is, from a strategic risk perspective, the inability to obtain license to operate because of community protests over the potential impacts to ecosystem health from a project, operational risks from unexpected capital or operating costs because of the declining water quality in the watershed, or for a financial risk would be restricted access to capital because financial institutions start to put limitations or constraints on the money that they can allocate to companies just because of resource scarcity, whether in a geographic region or just a broad sector base. So the availability of ecosystem services is a material risk for the oil and gas sector. The circle that you're seeing is really just a high-level overview of the landscape of some of the material ES risks, and that includes things like climate regulation, waste treatment, air quality regulation, water, and raw materials. And the risks is just a bit of a high-level pass of what some of those potential risks are: land use access, increased costs for reclamation, et cetera. So these need to be on the radar of decision makers as they're planning their growth strategies, as they're looking at how they, for example, implement a management system or train staff or build their organizations. These issues and these risks are not as prevalent at the table of decision makers as they could be. But many companies are looking at their environmental risks and communicating and disclosing these to the public. So you might be familiar with Suncor or Shell or ConocoPhillips. They produce typically an annual sustainability report in the attempt to disclose their performance and a bit of a narrative on management's perspective on environmental issues and the risks facing their business. So there are four main aspects. The reporting aspects in the middle is where I'll call your attention to, typically, of when you have a non-financial disclosure in sustainability. So disclosure is typically the driver behind the report. What is really the message that they're trying to communicate? Transparency is the specific what and how much they're going to communicate. Performance is a bit of a narrative around the company's goal setting, their actions, their outcomes, Typically, we like to see as well as where they might have missed a target and what they're doing to address it, but that's not always feasible. As well as you'll often see quantitative performance data and trends year over year. The scope is really what is the boundary of reporting. So there's a geographic scale, and they typically report on things like where their operations are located and the type of assets that they own. So what we saw from 2000 to 2012 was really a focus on a public relations exercise, really looking at enhancing their brand through these sustainability, often called greenwashing reports. The attempt was really to focus on just as much information to stakeholders as possible. You saw really lengthy reports, anywhere from 60 to 100 pages, just really overwhelming stakeholders with a lot of data. A lot of historical data as well, so you really weren't able to really understand where the company was going, but you'd have a really good view of where they were 5 years ago. And they were really looking only at their very specific operational impact. So the boundary within which they were looking at reporting was very, very concise. It might have just been a mine site or the location of a facility. But what we're starting to see is a bit of a shift. So what you're seeing on the right-hand side of your screen is a linkage between their strategy and how they're executing on their strategy and how sustainability performance could potentially be a limiting factor. They're really focusing more on material issues, and I'll talk about that in a moment. They're reporting on targets and real-time data as well. You'll see a lot of companies are starting to put up information on a more quarterly basis rather than biannual or annual. And they're starting to look at the impacts across the value chain as well and taking a much more holistic perspective. But it's not anywhere near where it actually could be in terms of a level of sophistication. But they are reporting things like total water withdrawal, their greenhouse gas emissions, but it really is just focused on water, air emissions, and material use. So there is a strong need for more indicators with an ecosystem services perspective. So oil and gas companies could be applying a much more standardized approach with the right indicators, as I've said, to improve how they measure, report, and manage ecosystem services overall. They're already using a lot of tools and frameworks, and I'll talk just about two. The first is the Global Reporting Initiative. It's a broad framework with a number of indicators to look at your economic, social, and environmental performance. They do provide guidance to the oil and gas sector as well, and in 2011 released some guidance on ecosystem services reporting and where you might be able to look at some performance data around that. Materiality assessments on the right-hand side. This is a technique that we use to help companies identify what are the really critical issues that are important for your business, and they're important to your stakeholders as well. And so it presents itself as a bit of a heat map. So in the top right corner, you'll see what's called sort of a really material issue. And so material issues, you can think of them as whether or not the data is miscommunicated or it's omitted, it could influence a stakeholder's ability to make a really good assessment on the health of your organization. And so that's where we tend to focus sustainability reporting now, is on a materiality basis. You don't need to boil the ocean, but if your stakeholders and critical issues to your business are related to climate change, water, and engagement with Aboriginal communities, that's really where you should actually target your focus. So I've limited this amount of time just specifically talking about sustainability reporting, and I know how broad ecosystem services are, but in the conversations that I've had with a number of senior leaders in the oil and gas company, that this is actually an area that I think could actually resonate with them. They recognize the importance for their brand value and their license to operate, to communicate to stakeholders on a regular basis what their material issues are and how they're managing them. So if we were using language like risk management, material issues, disclosure, engagement with investors and other stakeholders, if we were applying the right indicators rather than just looking at things like total water withdrawal, we could actually look at, say, the cumulative effect of users on the watershed. I think we could really scale up how ecosystem service is used in the oil and gas sector in this province. Thank you.